And the name of today's talk is Beyond Paying Attention, Mindfulness-Based Attitudes and Values. And so on retreat, some of you have heard this story. I'd like to give you this story. It's a relatively brief story. See what you think. There once was a very young boy in ancient China who wanted to enter a monastery that he knew was essentially an entirely silent monastery. In fact, in this monastery, the monks were only allowed to deliver 2 words per year to the head monk. And so this young boy went in for a whole year. He was studying the sutras, the ancient texts. He was meditating, he was contemplating, he was sweeping up the place. And after 1 entire year in silence had transpired, he was able to deliver his 2 words to the head monk. He, of course, bowed like a good monk to his teacher. And he gave his 2 words, and he said, "Bed's hard." He bowed to the head monk. He went away. For an entire year again, he toiled in silence. He swept up the place. He meditated, he contemplated. Now, at the end of the 2nd year of silence, he bows to give his 2 words to his teacher, and he says, "Food stinks." He bowed again. He went away. You get the idea. Another year in silence transpires. 3 years essentially entirely silent. He bows to the head monk and he says, "I quit." And the head monk said, "I would imagine so, because it's been nothing but negativity and complaints ever since you got here." And, it's a lighthearted story, and yet at the same time, it's a wonderful story to sort of confront us in that lighthearted way with the nature of the mind and how many judgments we tend to have on a given basis. And I was contemplating attitudes in mindfulness practice recently, and it seems that many of the books on mindfulness practice devote, maybe a page, maybe a paragraph, maybe a whole 2 pages to mindful attitudes, which I'll cover a little bit. But I got to thinking that, attitudes often are seen in context. That is, we are meditating, we want to have an accepting, open attitude. But what happens when we're not meditating? When life is happening to us? Much more challenging. So I thought about this distinction between an attitude and a value. And just playing with this idea, it's not set in stone, the idea that attitudes are often an orientation towards experience in a particular context. In other words, it's easy to feel tender, and I think for many people, if not most, easy to feel tender and kind to a small infant, especially if they're not wailing on your 24-hour flight overseas. It might be easy to feel that. But can you bring that kind of tenderness and kindness to the person who is judgmental or not acting in accord with what you think is appropriate? And that, I would say, is a value if you can extend that attitude into other contexts so that it's not conditioned by a situation. So just playing with that idea. So values can extend beyond meditation and orient us towards seeing our life and other people in a more spacious way that's not constrained by situations. Sometimes I make the distinction, as others have, between a value and a goal. We can have the goal to achieve a particular outcome, or we can hold on to and cultivate a particular value whereby we might reach our goal, but even if we don't reach our goal, we will have seen a lot of the terrain of our life from the perspective of our value. So just play with that. So some of the values or attitudes in mindfulness practice, of course, the primary attitude is that of acceptance. And I'm thinking that all experience is created by certain conditions. So I'd like you to consider, what conditions support your acceptance. You might even think of the thing you don't accept or rail against the most. What is it that creates acceptance? Because acceptance just does not arise, just like a flower does not arise independently of the soil and the water and the sun. Acceptance doesn't arise within you, within us, without certain conditions supporting it. And so some of the ideas I had was, one, looking at the poisons here of Buddhist psychology, our attachment, and especially our aggression. So sometimes we want to cultivate loving kindness, friendliness, and at other times we want to restrain from indulging in our aggression, our negative judgments, let's say, in relationship to other people and other things. And that may be one way of preserving or guarding our capacity to be accepting. And remember, acceptance is not tolerating, which is, I think of tolerating as sort of a closed-fisted way of encountering the world, and more like cognitively just being able to say, well, I accept that, but your body might be telling you otherwise. And acceptance is also not liking something. We don't have to like something to accept the reality of it. And as the wise woman and wisdom teacher Byron Katie once said, when I argue with reality, reality wins, but only 100% of the time. So think about that. Another core attitude, which can translate into a value as well, is that of patience. Patience. When I think of patience and think about what conditions support patience, for me, it's often slowing down, It's also about relinquishing an attachment to a particular outcome. The common trite example is standing in a long line and wanting to be at the head of the line, especially as the person at the front of the line is engaging in what we judge to be some inane conversation that is slowing the process down and not getting us what we want. So letting go of judgments, slowing down, and relinquishing expectations and attachments can support patience, as can expanding our field of awareness. If we are hyper-focused on the 5 people in front of us in that line, which is a metaphor, of course, for other things in our life, then we are not seeing other aspects around us, beauty, kindness, etc. And so another attitude is that of openness. What does that mean? Openness. Often openness is complemented by the words without analysis. So we want to be open in our experience, but without intellectual analysis, which of course can happen from time to time. So one of the conditions that I find that diminishes the intellectual analysis is shining the spotlight on sensory awareness. So that's what we were doing, some of that, in our body-centered meditation, moving into the senses without the intellectual analysis. The old 60s saying, get out of your mind and into your senses, comes to mind. So that can support openness. Gentleness is another attitude that's often talked about, written about in mindfulness practice. What can support gentleness? Maybe consider in your life, where are you not so gentle? And in those places, and it might be even just, within your body, a sense of gentleness not being there. Well, what's there if gentleness is not there? It might be tension, it might be aggression, it might be a judgment. And so I like to use the words soft and softness to sort of provide an antidote for the gentleness or the lack of gentleness, or maybe the aggression, which is the shadow of gentleness. So we can play with that. Curiosity is another attitude. Looking into our experience, not just in meditation, but in everyday life. Really being curious about the other person in front of you. This works really well in long-term relationships and short-term relationships. But long-term relationships, whether that be in a work context or a personal partnered relationship, we can really habituate to the other person and lose our sense of curiosity and miss what the other person is saying, not just the words, but the intention and the emotional resonance of what's being said. So if we value curiosity, we can adopt a curious stance through our posture, through our eyes, through our vocal tone. There's a shadow to everything, though, I can think I'm adopting a posture of curiosity and ask that person, what do you mean by that? With some subtext of judgment or criticism. So, working an honest mindfulness program here is also recognizing that we very well can espouse these wonderful attitudes and values, but the shadow looms behind us. So we have to be willing to look into that, lest we play the role without being integrated with or aligned with those attitudes and values. So just a couple more ideas here. The idea of not striving is so important. Not that there's anything wrong with goal orientation, but particularly in meditation and often in life, it's important to stay connected to the present moment. And when we stay connected to the present moment, we realize that the outcome, will take care of itself if you are walking that path or doing what you intend to do along the way. And again, nothing wrong with goal attainment. I'm thinking of, some writing projects where when I visualize the end of the project, that feels like a great burden, the myth of Sisyphus with this great stone on my shoulder, carrying it up the mountain only to lose the stone that tumbles down the mountain. But if I stick to the sentence that I'm writing, or maybe even the word, it seems a lot easier. And then lastly, there are many attitudes we can talk about, but one I want to talk about that I encountered in some of my own studies is that of what might be called an uplifted attitude or a dignified attitude. I rather like this idea of an uplifted attitude because this is one for me that can really make sense in an embodied way. Think about the times you've meditated where you're kind of slumping and crouching and constricted, or maybe in conversation with someone, particularly a difficult conversation. Being upright in our posture, of course, is not a recipe for feeling anything in particular. It's not about feeling good. It's about being connected to what's there And when we are upright, we are adopting the neuropsychological posture of alertness, awareness. I'm not talking about hypervigilance, because we can combine that uplifted posture through the eyes, through the spine. We can combine that with a sense of gentleness, with a sense of openness, because all of these attitudes and values are interdependent. As the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh would say, they inter-are. They inter-are. We can think of them as co-creating one another. So if gentleness is there, of course openness is there or not far away. So uplifted we can also think of as being the embodiment of our inherent self-worth. Our inherent self-worth. What some traditions call, the Shambhala tradition I believe calls, our basic goodness. Not goodness as opposed to badness, but rather the goodness that comes with connecting to the energy of life by virtue of us being here right now, having the worthiness to be in this place, in time, right now. And we often shirk, we often constrict from that when we are stressed, when we are tense. So two items that can support us, and I'll close here, open it up. Many of you are familiar with the ancient term vipassana, sometimes referred to as vipassana, roughly translated or transliterated as insight into the nature of things. By that I mean insight into the nature of impermanence, suffering, non-self. But also, in a more comprehensive way, insight can refer to deeply looking into, or vipassana can refer to deeply looking into the nature of things, so that you really have this understanding. So, for example, applying our mindfulness-based insight to the place where we are impatient, we remember that word remember, that I link to mindfulness, the old interpretation of mindfulness, sati. Remembering that everything is impermanent can help our impatience. When we are connected to this kind of insight into the nature of things, that can help us free up our rigidity. The complement of vipassana in the meditation tradition is encapsulated by an ancient word that many people are not familiar with, even long-term meditators, and that is shamatha or samatha. Now, that word translates into peaceful abiding or deeply abiding, sometimes equated with serenity. Peaceful abiding is what I notice most off in others' teachings, and that's how I've learned about it. And so, just quickly, we can cultivate peaceful abiding, not necessarily easily, by doing a concentration, one-pointed meditation, let's say on the breath, whereby we're just focused on the in and out breath, or we're doing some breath counting, and we're restricting our focus into that one point of focus. That creates a level of concentration, one-pointedness, that corresponds to cultivating this peaceful abiding. However, depending on how the mind is being worked in that process, it may not cultivate vipassana, insight into the nature of things. Now it may, depending on what presence of mind you bring to it. Do you notice the impermanence of the in-breath and the out-breath, for example? So peaceful abiding and insight go together. I'm not separating them artificially, but distinguishing them so that, getting back to the topic here, they can, or we can draw upon them as resources to support our attitudes and values on a mindful path. Calm abiding or peaceful abiding and insight can support us in embodying mindful attitudes and values.